Alright, so in 2001, a movie was released, and the movie was Joe Dirt. And it wasn't a great movie by any stretch of the imagination. It certainly wasn't Citizen Kane. Nobody's going to get together with friends and say, it was a brilliant piece of cinema? That Joe Dirt. But it was funny, it was charming, it had heart, it had a strong narrative from start to finish, and it's just one of those sort of guilty pleasure movies. I'm a cinephile. I like movies in all their many forms, whether good or bad or mediocre. Not I'm not saying that it's the greatest comedy of all time, not even close. It's no Animal House, but it's good. It's funny, and I watch it anytime it comes on. I've probably seen it close to 30 times at this point, and it never gets less funny. And that's mostly due to the star of the movie, David Spade, who really doesn't get enough love these days. He was a brilliant cast member on Saturday Night Live. He was contemporary of Chris Farley and Phil Hartman, and he was part of what I consider to be one of the best casts that Saturday Night Live has ever had. He played memorable characters, and he was also in some movies with Chris Farley, Tommy Boy, Black Sheep. He was sort of the straight man to Chris Farley's frenetic man-child character. He was the sort of deeply flawed but mostly rational anchor that kept Farley's character from going too far. And of course, we all saw what happens when Chris Farley didn't have David Spade to play off of. You get Beverly Hills Ninja. I don't think I have to say any more on that subject. So, yeah, David Spade, with this character, it worked. He was the hapless loser with a heart of gold. Over the course of this movie, he meets colorful characters, he gets into many mishaps, but in spite of all the side trips that this movie takes, it still maintains that core narrative of the hapless loser who was abandoned as a child, and over the course of his life, he's trying to find his way in the world and find what happened to his parents. He doesn't realize that they just abandoned him. He sort of thinks that maybe they just accidentally left him behind. And over his travels, it turns out, no, his parents are horrible people, and the things that he was looking for in life, acceptance and riches and things of that sort, he had really had all along. The family that he was searching for his entire life, he didn't need to search for a family because he had a family all along in his friends and in the character of Brandy, who is a very strong female character who, for God knows what reason, falls in love with this guy. And it's a sappy, dopey, very, very sophomoric and juvenile sort of comedy, but it is a comedy that has a great deal of heart and a nice story from start to finish. So, last year, when it was announced that Crackle, a free internet streaming service, was going to produce and air for free a sequel to Joe Dirt, I was actually thrilled. And I don't want you to think I'm going into this review as, well, I knew this movie was going to suck, and so I always intended to bash this movie. No, I was actually very happy to hear about it. I thought, you know what? It's been 14 years. Why not? This is not exactly a sequel that needs to be made, but it's nice that it's being made. It'll be nice to revisit these characters. I would love to see what they're doing 14 years down the line. And so I downloaded the Crackle app, and I started watching Joe Dirt 2 Beautiful Loser, as the movie is called. And 5 minutes into it, I had to turn it off. It was just awful from the very beginning. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I almost felt betrayed by the first 5 minutes of this movie. But I started to kind of badmouth it on Facebook, and I realized I wasn't being very fair. Because I can be a very harsh critic of movies, but I try to be fair with it. I try to give every movie a fair chance before I start bashing it. And I realized I wasn't doing myself or the movie any justice by bashing it based on the first 5 minutes. So in spite of my better judgment, I decided to sit through Joe Dirt 2 in its entirety. And it wasn't easy. Literally, it wasn't easy. Apparently, the Crackle app has a bug in it. It's a terrible app. And the bug makes it to where occasionally when an ad plays, and trust me, there are ads all throughout everything they show. They'll show a block of 4 ads, and they'll do it several times in a movie. It's kind of distracting. But there's a bug in it to where it'll show an ad, and then instead of starting back where you left off, it'll go back to the first 5 minutes of the movie. And to give you an idea of how really confusing and disjointed this movie is, the first time it happened, I didn't even notice. And when I did notice, I tried to go back to where I was before, and the app kept giving me problems. So I ended up torrenting Joe Dirt 2. I mean, think about that for a second. I illegally downloaded a terrible movie that you can see for free on a terrible video streaming site. This is my commitment to being fair to this movie. So it took me about an hour to torrent it, and I started watching it. And I want to start off by saying that the movie opens with 2 characters. And I do want to say before I start that this is going to be completely full of spoilers. I'm going to give away the entire plot to the movie. So if you haven't seen it, and for God knows what fucking reason you actually want to see this horrible, horrible movie, then by all means turn off the review until after you've seen the movie. But if you're like me and you want an excuse not to watch it, then by all means, keep watching this video. So the movie opens outside of, I think, a barber shop, and there are these 2 characters, an old black man and this redneck that kind of sounds like he's supposed to be Farmer Fran from the first movie, you know, the kind of Cajun guy, you know, homie, where you make it? You want to see Homo's name? Homie, where you make it? Like, he kind of sounds like that guy, but he's completely not. So these 2 random characters, who, by the way, are never mentioned or referenced again at any point in the actual story, they have no point for being there, are just sitting there bullshitting about God knows what. They're talking about the Grand Canyon and how much it sucks for some reason. Yeah, I don't know. And then their conversation is interrupted by a voice off camera. And the camera pans slightly to the left, and we see Dennis Miller's character from the first movie, Xander Kelly, sitting in a lawn chair in a flannel shirt for absolutely no reason. Saying something, I know a guy that was left at the Grand Canyon. His name's Joe Dirt, and this is his story. I mean, that's not exactly what he says, but he's basically setting it up. And by the way, I would like to point out that Xander Kelly shows up twice in this movie, and the entirety of his time in the movie rounds up to about maybe a minute and a half, and it does nothing to further the story along. He doesn't have any part of the plot. He's just there so the movie makers can say, hey, look, kids, it's Dennis Miller as Xander Kelly. So it makes no sense for him to be there. But anyway, so he gives an introduction to the movie, basically. And then we go on into the story. Well, kinda. It actually goes into a very ham-fisted Sopranos parody. They're doing a parody of the opening sequence to The Sopranos, where he's driving around in the car looking all badass, and the song is playing, and it cuts to different camera angles of the things he's seeing, and by the way, bravo David Spade for staying on the cutting edge of comedy with a reference to a show that ended several years ago. Were all the Saint Elsewhere jokes taken? Was Alf busy that day? So anyway, they do a Sopranos parody for no reason, and then cut to Joe Dirt sitting on a park bench, and yes, now they've jumped immediately into a Forrest Gump parody. And I have to say, during the intro, when he's driving around, they're doing the Sopranos thing, my heart sank. Not just at the bad Sopranos parody, the camera work was so bad, it looked like it was shot on an iPhone. No, actually, fuck that. It looks like it was shot on the phone that I'm using to shoot this. You see how bad the video quality is? Wasn't much better. And then the Happy Madison logo came up. Yes, Adam Sandler's production company, of course, was responsible for this, because why wouldn't they be? I just really want Adam Sandler to die of bone cancer at this point. But anyway, it launches into the story, and so Joe Dirt is sitting on a park bench, and this woman comes up, and sure enough, it's a Forrest Gump parody, and he does the whole spiel about the magic shoes that he has and whatnot. And the woman actually starts cursing at him and saying, fuck you for doing a Forrest Gump thing. And you know, in the first 5 minutes of the movie, when the movie tells you exactly how bad it is, that's not usually a good sign. So she leaves, and then another woman comes up. And let me just say at this point that David Spade looks bad. And I don't mean he hasn't aged well, which he hasn't, but that doesn't really matter. The wig, the mullet wig. Yes, he's using a mullet wig again. Now, if you'll remember the end of the first movie, Brandy had styled his mullet wig into what she called something more contemporary, which is this weird sort of pineapple with dreadlocks thing going on. And it was funny. It was a great visual gag. And at the beginning of this movie, he has the mullet wig again, which it's a wig. It doesn't grow. It doesn't change. It's fake hair. It's established that his mother put the wig on him as a baby, and he had sort of an incomplete closure at the top of his skull that closed around the wig, so the wig became permanent. So, yeah, it's a wig. But he has no reason to have this wig again. He had the dreadlock thing before, and now he's got the mullet. Anyway, let's forget about that. That's actually one of the least egregious things about this movie. The wig itself looks terrible. It looks like something that came off of a rack at Party City. I made a comment on Facebook after watching the first 5 minutes that it gave the impression that you were watching a bad Joe Dirt cosplayer that took a handful of Valium before Comic-Con. He's not at all committing to it in the beginning of the movie. He's like, the accent comes and goes. Like, sometimes he's talking the way David Spade usually talks, and then occasionally he'll put some twang on certain words, and there's no consistency there. And it sort of gives the impression that that scene is the last scene that they filmed after he had already filmed all the other footage, and he's sitting there realizing, wow, I filmed this giant lump of shit, and now I have to do and he just wasn't at all committing to it, and he looked tired, and he looked defeated by life. And it was kind of sad, really, to watch that. But anyway, he moves on to the story, and he's telling the story to the woman. So wait a minute. It turns out that this scene is an introduction to the movie. But then what about the scene we just had with Xander Kelly doing an introduction to the movie? That means that was an introduction to an introduction, and therefore completely redundant and pointless. Again, the scene served no purpose other than to say, hey kids, it's Dennis Miller. So anyway, he starts telling his story. And apparently in the time since the first Joe Dirt, he and Brandy have gotten married. And they had children, triplets in fact, 3 little girls. And it shows the birth of the little girls. And the hospital scene has Brandy in the stirrups, Joe Dirt at her side. And I gotta say, she's the model of composure during the childbirth. She's not screaming, she's not breathing heavily, she's just smiling and calm for the birth of triplets for some reason. And the doctor walks in, and it's this hot-looking woman smoking a cigarette, like you do, who's making off-color comments about Brandy's vagina for some reason, and is blowing smoke at the vagina, which I guess is supposed to be funny. I guess it's supposed to be a sight gag of some sort, or some odd juxtaposition, like, oh, look, this person is acting in a way that no doctor acts. Isn't that silly? And then they work in, for some reason, a joke that she's a lesbian because the nurse comes in, and apparently the nurse is her girlfriend, and there's this very awkward moment where they're both staring at Brandy's vagina, and then they turn to each other like they're gonna make out, and then Joe Dirt's head pops up from the middle, going, dang! And yeah, the fact that she's a lesbian is basically made into a punchline for this. And so anyway, we get through this very awkward scene in the hospital and move on into the future. We see some shots of the little girls growing up, and they love their father very much, as they do in these movies. And it's set up that Joe is now a logger, and it's supposed to be sort of a throwback to the scene in the first movie where Joe worked at an oil rig, and nobody on the job liked him, and everybody wanted to kick his ass. And they even do a thing where they're all eating lunch, and they do a throwback to in the first movie where he asks the guy for his apple core. They do it again. They repeat the joke. They don't change it. They don't put a spin on it. It's exactly the same joke. It's like, hey, I'm kind of hungry. Can I have your apple core? Now, instead of there being a fight scene, it has all of the other members of the logging crew walking up to Joe one by one, bending over, and farting directly into his face. These long, drawn-out farts. Like one guy, he bends over and he farts. And they laugh, and then the next guy walks up, and he farts right in Joe's face. And the whole time, they're making jokes like, oh, I gotta check my underwear on that one. And Joe's just like, oh, it's stanky. And he doesn't, like, get up and walk away. But he just sits there, and they just keep coming, farting in his face. And then a woman walks up, a hot woman in Daisy Dukes, and she's like, leave Joe Dirt alone. And you think, oh, well, she's a Brandy-like character that is going to come to Joe's aid, like you do in these movies, which would have been okay, except when she walks up, she then bends over and does a long, drawn-out fart inches away from his face, and everybody laughs, and I guess it's supposed to be like, oh, look, they had the woman do the thing that the man did, and isn't that wacky, because girls don't fart in people's faces. Fuck you, movie. So, and I gotta say, this goes on for an uncomfortably long period of time. If you've ever read Cujo by Stephen King, one of the worst books the man ever wrote, in the middle of the book, there is a scene where it takes 4 pages for Stephen King to describe the mailman farting. I shit you not. Go to the library, check out this book. 4 pages, 1 fart. It's completely pointless. It does nothing to further the story along. It's like that in that the farting in Joe's face scene takes 4 minutes. 4 minutes of people lining up, bending over, and farting inches away from a man's face. Now, the scene does serve a purpose, though. It's to set up that Brandy and the kids have walked up and have seen Joe being humiliated, which in Joe's eyes means the girls no longer respect him and think he's a loser, which sets up events later in the movie. So, I mean, I don't want it to seem like the movie has no rhyme or reason. Like, things occasionally happen for a reason in this movie. More often than not, they don't, though. But this is the main theme of the movie. Basically, Joe doesn't think he's a good enough father to his children. So, we progress a little more, and there's a tornado, because why not? And they even rip off Twister in this scene. You see a cow going "Rrrr" in the tornado. And so they're getting to shelter, and one of his girls says, Daddy, I lost blah, blah, blah. It's back in the trailer. You gave it to me as a present. And so Joe, being the good father that he is, gets his kids to safety and runs back into the tornado to get whatever this was. And he goes in the trailer, and you guessed it, they do a Wizard of Oz parody. The tornado picks up the trailer, and Joe gets knocked out. And when he wakes up, the trailer has landed on a biker whose feet are now sticking out from underneath the trailer like the Wicked Witch of the West, and he is wearing ruby-studded biker boots. Yeah, the movie does that. And it's kind of a common theme in this movie and it's a theme of a lot of bad movies where they will reference far superior movies in an attempt to make themselves look better. Now, the first movie didn't rely on this. I mean, yes, it did have a Silence of the Lambs parody in the middle with Buffalo Bob, but it was one thing, and it worked. And it was part of the actual story because he meets up with this guy during his overall quest to find information about his parents and the vacation that they took all those years ago. So it's not pointless. It furthers the story along, which none of the parodies in this movie even come close to doing. So anyway, Biker's dead, and the biker gang is there, and the second in command is played by Patrick Warburton, who is basically in this movie so that we can hear Patrick Warburton yell a lot, which people like, and maybe that will distract us from how bad this movie really is. And for the scenes that he's in, he is funny. He doesn't make the story any better. He doesn't make the story funnier, but Patrick Warburton is basically being Patrick Warburton at this point, and that's kind of entertaining. So it turns out that since Joe has killed this biker, he gets to keep his ruby-studded boots and is the new leader of the gang. Well, he ends up getting kicked out of the gang because, of course, he's Joe Dirt, and he does Joe Dirt things. And so as he's running off, the bikers realize he has the ruby biker boots, and now they have to chase after him like the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. And my brain hurts thinking about this. It really does. Over the course of the scene, it actually turns out that he's in 1965. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. There is fucking time travel in this movie. Now, I'm not going to say that Joe Dirt 1 was the most logical movie ever. I mean, yes, they had some very big leaps of logic. You had the whole thing with the wig. You had the fact that his facial hair only grows in a certain way. You have him spending days upon days flying around in a balloon shaped like a tooth. But it does follow a logic of sorts. It follows some logic that is somewhat grounded in reality. They certainly don't do anything supernatural or involving fucking time travel. So he sort of realizes, for some reason, that since 1965 is the year of his birth, he's now following along his own timeline. And so basically what the movie does at this point is has Joe Dirt going through the decades, not aging at all, but he realizes that he has to get back to Silvertown on the day that he met Brandy, which was, of course, the scene in the first movie where they get the dog's nuts off the porch. And he says, I have to do this, and if I don't meet Brandy, it's going to ruin everything. So he ends up running from the bikers. There's a scene involving Brandy's mother and the father of another character in the movie who's basically the new Robbie. You remember Robbie from the first movie played by Kid Rock? Well, they couldn't get Kid Rock, so they got Mark fucking McGrath from Sugar Ray to play the new bad guy, the person that is vying for Joe's attention with Brandy. And in this scene, he's playing that character's father. And they're at a drive-in 1965 watching some movie, and she leaves the car to do something, and he proceeds to cut a hole in the bottom of a box of popcorn. Yes, he's doing the thing where you stick your dick through the hole in the bottom of the popcorn, and she reaches in thinking she's getting popcorn, but oh no, she's jerking you off. Because that always works. Well, she doesn't get back to the car, and then other people randomly walk up to the car and want his popcorn for some reason. It's like these teenage girls and a balding middle-aged man who all reach into the popcorn thing, and at first he's trying to go, no, don't, stop. And then the more they tug, and they are tugging at his dick on this point. One of them even says, why is it not coming out? After a while, he's like, no, don't stop. And then the payoff is he jizzes all over the popcorn when the dude is touching his penis. Because that's apparently comedy. Fuck you, movie. So, he meets Brandy's mother. He actually meets a few people on the course of this journey that are a little surprising. He meets one guy who turns out to be Buffalo Bob from the first movie as a younger man, and we realize this when the character says that he's thinking of digging a pit in his living room and then asks Joe if his wife is a great big fat person. No, she's not a great big fat person. Well, can you let me know if she becomes a great big fat person? And okay, I'm going to go ahead and say that that one scene is worth a chuckle or two. It's one of the few scenes in the movie where you will legitimately sort of crack a grin or chuckle. He also goes into a bar and meets Lynyrd Skynyrd. Well, kinda. It's Gary Rossington and Ronnie Van Zant and a couple other guys before they become Lynyrd Skynyrd. And of course, Joe, being the Skynyrd fan that he is, has this awesome moment with Lynyrd Skynyrd where he's basically guiding them. He's saying, "Oh, y'all need to change your name to Lynyrd Skynyrd, and y'all, that song Freebird, that's going to be 9 minutes and 8 seconds long," and it's a kind of a charming scene, and you do have an actual emotional moment in this movie. Where Ronnie Van Zant says, "Oh man, we're going to be famous. We're going to be able to afford our own airplane." And when he says airplane, the music gets very sad, and Joe gets this kind of faraway look in his eyes where he's remembering, of course, that Ronnie Van Zant dies in a plane crash 8 years after the events of the scene. And it is a genuine moment of emotion in this movie, and it's one that I do kind of have to applaud David Spade for. It's sort of a callback to the first movie, the moment where Joe hears Brandy on the phone saying that his parents had died when he was a child and not to look for him. And he has that sort of lost moment where he has to sort of walk off and be by himself. And it's sort of a parallel to that. And in that one instance in this movie, it actually works. It does bring some depth to the character and to the film. Don't get used to it. It just turns to shit after that. Now, I will say at this point, there is about a 20-minute chunk of the movie where it actually starts to feel like Joe Dirt, where the pacing is familiar to what we saw in the first movie, where the jokes are similar to what we had in the first movie. And it's sort of like David Spade, for the briefest of moments, remembering what it's like to play this character. Don't get used to it. It doesn't last long. Now, he ends up finding himself accosted by these two thugs who knock him out and rip out his kidney. And they leave him on a desert island that he ends up spending the next 12 years on. And they basically do a Castaway parody where he makes Wilson and then he has sex with Wilson repeatedly. And he grows a long, shaggy beard. And at the end of the 12 years, it turns out that he's actually not on a desert island and he's actually on the coast of Miami. And there's a Marriott like 100 yards that way this whole time. Because why not? Oh, and I would also like to go back a little bit. If I get things out of order, it's just because this movie is such a disjointed mess that it's impossible to keep this shit straight. Now, at one point before all this, he does run into the bikers again. And the police show up. And there's this very ham-fisted bit of foreshadowing where Joe's like, "Arrest those guys!" And the cops look and they're like, "What guys?" And he turns and looks and nobody is there. Because why not? There was a whole biker gang with like 30 guys and all of a sudden they're not there anymore. That comes into play. Just deal with it for now. So anyway, the year is now, I think, 1973 or so. 77, actually. The year is 1977. Yes, I does not math. But anyway, he ends up running into Christopher Walken's character from the first movie. And yes, we do have a few cameos like that in the movie. We have a cameo from the guy that played Kicking Wing. It's in a dream sequence. where he's in now no longer a veterinarian or selling fireworks. He's a drug dealer who only sells weed and aspirin because that's basically the snakes and sparklers of the drug world. And, this scene actually starts a very horrifying trend in this movie where they show jokes that are based on internet memes. I don't know if you've ever seen the Deal With It shades, where a character will say something snarky, and then these pixelated 8-bit sunglasses will slowly slide down the frame over their eyes. That actually happens. Joe says something snarky, there's a freeze frame, and the pixelated sunglasses drop down over his eyes, and then the pixelated words, thug life, end up below his face. They actually do that. I am so sorry. There's also another scene where a character in 1965 says the phrase, "Do you even lift?" I'm surprised there weren't any My Little Pony references in this shit, but let's move on. Anyway, he meets Walken's character, Clem, before he becomes Clem, because you'll remember he was in the Witness Protection Program, he was a mob enforcer. Well, this is back when he was a mob enforcer. And he and Joe Dirt become friends, because Joe has future knowledge of sports events that Clem can bet on, and both of them become rich beyond their wildest dreams. So Joe's all kinds of fucking up the timeline at this point. He ends up coming to the day that he meets Brandy, because the passage of time means nothing in this movie. 1 minute it's 1977, and the next minute it's 2001. Because why not? So Joe has to run to meet Brandy, but he's late, and so instead of him helping Charlie the dog get his nuts off the porch, Mark fucking McGrath's character does. The douchebag. The new Robbie, basically. So Brandy ends up falling in love with him, which, I gotta say, this ends up flying in the face of the fact that in the first movie, Brandy was a strong female character. She was strong and independent and didn't need a man to complete her life, but she fell in love with Joe. In this movie, she'll just fuck any old guy. And she does. She ends up marrying him and ends up getting strung out on heroin. So basically what this movie is saying is, without Joe Dirt, Silvertown turns into a crack community, and Brandy, the strong female lead in the first movie, just becomes a whore that shoots up smack. Because why not? So anyway, Joe learns a lesson at the end of the movie that I didn't need to be rich. I was rich all along, and my family loves me, and whatever the fuck. So anyway, the movie ends with him waking up, and it's all a dream. And he's reunited with his family. And the tornado was where he got knocked out, and all of that was just a dream. Well, kinda, because it turns out that Patrick Warburton's character, the biker, was actually an angel who was sent to teach Joe a lesson, and that's why he disappeared earlier in the movie with that whatever the fuck. It's confusing as shit. So anyway, he's walking with his family, telling the children the story of his experiences in the dream, and he comes across this tree with a sign on it. And let me backtrack a little bit and say there's a scene in 1965 where he buys some comic books. He figures, I'm buying comic books for 10 cents, and in 2015, they'll be worth millions of dollars. And so he buries these comics in this cheap little metal box with a simple little latch on it at the base of this tiny little sapling, and he nails a sign to the sapling that says, "Buried treasure, keep away." Well, wouldn't you know it, there's this big tall tree he sees that has that sign, "Buried treasure, keep away." And so he digs underneath it and he finds the box of comic books. Because why not? It was a dream, but the comics are now there. So he's like, "Brandy, we're rich." And she's like, "Oh, Joe Dirt, you were rich all along. You just didn't know it." Which is supposed to be a callback to a very similar line from the first movie. And then the movie ends which is great because at this point you're just praying for the sweet release of death. This movie goes nowhere. Oh, and I mentioned Xander Kelly at the beginning, Dennis Miller's character. He has one other cameo, and it's when he has the dream sequence with Kicking Wing. He wakes up from that, and then he falls back asleep, and he has a dream that he's sitting next to Dennis Miller, and Dennis Miller is telling him to wake up, and the movie references the fact that it's a movie. He actually says, "This is Joe Dirt 2, wake up." He actually names the movie they're in. Now, like I said, the first movie followed a set of logic. It wasn't perfect logic, but it was somewhat grounded in real-world logic. This movie actually references the fact that it's a fucking movie. That in no way fits with the universe that was set up by the first Joe Dirt. Now, I'm not going to say this movie is the worst movie ever made. I think that honor goes to Napoleon Dynamite. Or Ishtar, maybe. But it's not a good movie. It's poorly written, poorly constructed. The timeline is all over the place. It follows no sort of logic whatsoever. It's even more sophomoric and juvenile than the first film, and that's saying something. And overall, I came away from it feeling like, David Spade, you're better than this. You're better than this. I know lately all you've done is a few sitcom appearances here and there. But even the bad movies that you did without Chris Farley usually had something redeemable about them. You did okay. I don't see what went wrong. What went so horribly wrong with this movie? Anyway, that's my 2 cents on Joe Dirt 2. It was a travesty. Not nearly as bad as, say, Adam Sandler's Jack and Jill, but it was not a fitting sequel. It definitely was not worth the 14-year wait. And it comes across exactly like a movie that was made by a free internet streaming video site. Man, you know what? I can't even say that because there have been some movies produced for YouTube that are actually quite entertaining and watchable. So there really is no excuse at the end of the day for this. There is literally no excuse for this movie. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on Joe Dirt. It may have been free, but that's an hour and a half of my life that I will never get back. And for that, fuck you, movie.